Hey everyone, and welcome back to Becoming Ultimate Masters. We've had so many of you, or especially our younger listeners, reaching out asking about finding your path and that whole "what am I going to do with my life?"
Yeah.
question,
Yeah, it's a question we all grapple with at some point or another.
for sure. So today we're diving into the life of a real psychology giant to see how he figured it out. We're talking B.F. Skinner, the name behind behaviorism. You've probably heard of his theories, but today it's about the person.
The man behind the method.
Yeah, exactly. The twists and turns, and even the lucky breaks that shaped his whole journey.
Yeah, it's a great reminder that even the biggest names in science, they all had to start somewhere. Their paths weren't always, straight lines.
Totally. Okay, so let's unpack this. Skinner, he didn't exactly start out as, like, a psych prodigy. He was an English literature major in college. Not exactly like the typical path to behavioral science.
Just fascinating, right? What got him hooked on behavior wasn't some textbook. It was actually Bertrand Russell, the
Oh,
philosopher.
no.
Yeah. Russell was writing about this new concept of behaviorism.
And here's the kicker.
Hmm.
Russell thought he was actually debunking behaviorism in his writings.
Right.
But for Skinner, it was like total inspiration. It's like those times you read something that's meant to criticize an idea, but you end up even more convinced by it than ever.
Exactly. It just grabs you. And so Skinner, he went straight to Harvard for grad school, just dove headfirst into the work of Pavlov, Sherrington, Loeb, all the giants of behavioral research.
But he wasn't content with just, like, following their footsteps, right?
Yeah.
He was looking for something more.
More, yeah.
Like a way to understand the behavior of the whole organism, not
Yeah.
just isolated reflexes or, like dissected parts.
Yeah, that's a key distinction. He wasn't satisfied with just studying, like, how a muscle twitches.
Yeah.
He wanted to understand how a living being actually interacts with the world as a whole.
As a whole, yeah. So where does someone even start with that kind of ambition? Well, in Skinner's case, it all started with a very, very unusual contraption. His first invention was a soundproof box shaped like, wait for it, a mini Parthenon. I'm not kidding. He actually called it that.
It's amazing, isn't it, how even brilliant minds often start with these, like, almost childlike experiments.
Right.
And this Parthenon, it was meant to study how rats adapt to new stimuli, how they react to changes in their environment.
Makes sense. But, like any good scientist, Skinner was super observant. And what he discovered wasn't just about the rat's behavior, but the fact that they had babies. It was a happy accident, you could say.
Yeah, but a serendipity. And that shifted his focus. He became really intrigued by the reflexes of baby rats. And get this, he even built this super intricate device with piano wires to actually measure their tiny movement.
Piano wires. That sounds incredibly delicate, especially for baby rats.
It was, but it let him track these really subtle, tiny twitches and jumps and all that. And this is where things get really interesting. He had this thought. If this method works for baby rats, why not for adults too?
Right?
And that's how he got the idea for what would become his most famous invention, the Skinner box.
The Skinner box. But even the Skinner box, it wasn't like an overnight creation, right? It went through a ton of iterations, with Skinner always tweaking and improving the design.
Oh, absolutely. He started with this really long runway for the rats, but then he realized how much time he was wasting just like walking back and forth to get them. Talk about inefficient, right?
Oh, yeah.
So he was like, okay, there's got to be a better way. And he added this little back alley, turning it into a loop.
So smart, making his own life easier and advancing science all at the same time. That's what I call a win-win.
Definitely. And then eventually, he figured out a way to get the rat to deliver its own food reward. It was all about constantly refining, making it more effective, easier to manage. Honestly, that's a great lesson for anyone, for anything you're trying to achieve, not just science.
I agree. It's about that constant drive to improve, to find better solutions.
Totally. And speaking of improvement, Skinner's journey wasn't just about his inventions, it was also about recognizing opportunities, even in, like, unexpected places. And that leads us to two of his biggest lucky breaks.
Oh, okay. Lucky breaks, huh? I'm intrigued.
You could call it luck, yeah. But it's also about that scientific mindset, always observing, always looking for patterns. So the first break was the invention of the cumulative recorder.
Okay, I have to admit I'm not familiar with that one. What is it exactly?
Imagine a device that visually represents data as a curve, showing you how behavior changes over time. Now, here's the crazy part. Skinner didn't actually set out to invent it. He was just like tinkering around in the lab, happened to use a disc with a spindle, wound some string around it, and boom! A whole new way to visualize data was born.
So it was a bit of serendipity mixed with, like, scientific brilliance. It sounds like he was almost just playing around and stumbled onto this revolutionary tool.
Exactly. And you know what? It allowed him to see patterns in data that he might have otherwise completely missed. But that wasn't his only lucky break. Get this. He was running an experiment one day and the food magazine jammed.
Oh.
Now, most people would probably just be frustrated, right? But not Skinner. He saw potential in that malfunction.
What, you're telling me a broken machine led to a major scientific discovery?
It did. That jammed magazine actually led him to discover extinction curves,
Wow.
which are basically the patterns of behavior when a reward is no longer given.
Oh, that's interesting.
Think of it this way. You teach your dog to shake paws for a treat, Rich. Then you stop giving the treat. The extinction curve shows how long the dog will keep shaking its paw, even without the reward.
Fascinating.
It's actually a fundamental concept in understanding how learning works.
It's amazing. He was not only building on his own work, but turning these unexpected events into, like, opportunities. What a great lesson in adapting and thinking outside the box.
Exactly. Always be ready to adapt.
And you know what? As his methods were evolving, so was his approach to research. He started to move away from using those large groups of rats in his experiments.
Yeah, this was a huge shift from the traditional methods in psychology at the time.
Right.
Instead of focusing on averages from, large groups, he started zeroing in on individual subjects.
Okay, now why would he do that? It seems like studying a big group would give you way more data and be, like, way easier. So what was the advantage of this whole individual focus?
Yeah, you'd think so, right? But Skinner, he was convinced that averaging data from a big group could actually, mask important details.
Interesting.
Yeah, and by focusing on individual animals, he could really see the patterns, the variations. Those would have been totally lost in the crowd.
Okay, I see.
It's kind of like personalized medicine. You get a much deeper understanding of how things really work when you look at the individual, not just the average.
That makes sense. So he was, like, willing to trade a bit of efficiency for a more nuanced understanding.
Exactly.
That's dedication to the science.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's got to be more to it than just that. What was he hoping to uncover by studying, like, individuals?
Well, around this time, he was getting more and more interested in animal training. And when you're training an animal, you need consistent results, not just statistical probabilities.
Right.
You need to know that this dog will jump through that hoop every single time.
So it's about practical application, making sure the behaviors, like, worked reliably in the real world.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is where his work with pigeons comes in, right? Didn't he train them to do some pretty amazing things?
He did. In fact, during World War II, he was involved in this project called Project Pigeon, where they trained pigeons to, get this, guide missiles.
Wait, pigeons guiding missiles? That sounds straight out of, like, a science fiction movie.
It's true. They actually trained pigeons to peck at targets on a screen, and those pecks would control the missile's direction.
Whoa, so he was, like, taking these same principles he'd developed studying rats and applying them to a whole different species.
Exactly.
That's wild.
And it just shows that these principles weren't limited to one type of animal, They were these, fundamental principles of learning that could apply across a whole bunch of different species.
That makes sense. But it raises a pretty interesting question, How do you go from pigeons guiding missiles to understanding human behavior? That seems like a big jump.
It is a big leap, but the underlying principles are the same. Skinner believed that human behavior, just like animal behavior, is shaped by consequences.
Right.
We're more likely to repeat actions that are rewarded and less likely to repeat those that are punished.
Makes sense. So he was suggesting that, like, the same things that work for training a pigeon could also help us understand how humans learn, develop habits, even, like, change unwanted behaviors.
Exactly. That was his core argument. And he saw huge potential in applying these principles to fields like education, therapy, even social engineering.
Oh, wow. I can see how that idea might make some people kind of uncomfortable, It almost sounds like it could be taking away free will or, like, reducing humans to just machines that respond to stimuli.
Yeah, that's a valid concern for sure. And it's a debate that still goes on today. But Skinner always maintained that he wasn't trying to eliminate free will. He was just trying to understand the factors that influence our choices and our actions.
Okay. And to be fair, he did make big contributions to our understanding of how learning works. Like, his research on reinforcement schedules has been really influential.
Oh, absolutely. His research showed that the timing and frequency of rewards, they have a huge impact on how quickly and how well we learn.
Interesting.
And, that knowledge has been applied in so many ways, from designing educational programs to developing treatment plans for addiction, all sorts of things.
That's amazing. So, while some of his ideas might be controversial, there's no denying, like, the impact his work has had. But let's circle back to that idea of studying individual subjects for a sec. Didn't that make his research way more challenging? Wouldn't it have been easier to just average the results from, like, a huge group of rats and be done with it?
It might seem that way, yeah. But Skinner, he was really convinced that focusing on the individual was super important. It was essential to truly understanding the nuances of behavior.
Okay.
He believed that averaging data from a group could actually obscure important patterns and variations.
So he was willing to sacrifice some ease and efficiency for, like, a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the individual organism.
Precisely, and that really shows his commitment to, scientific rigor. He wasn't afraid to go against the grain, challenge those conventional methods if he believed it would lead to better science.
That's awesome. And to think this is all coming from a guy who started out studying English literature, it just goes to show you, you never know where your path might lead you. Sometimes those, like, unexpected detours are what lead to the most amazing discoveries.
It's so true. And it's such a powerful message for all of us, especially for those still figuring out their own journeys. It's okay to explore, to be open to new possibilities.
For sure.
You never know where your curiosity might take you.
Okay, let's dive back into the science a bit here. We've talked about his methods, his focus on individual subjects, his interest in animal training. But what about his actual findings? What were some of the key things he discovered about behavior?
Well, one of his most important discoveries was the incredible power of reinforcement. He showed that by consistently rewarding desired behaviors, we can actually shape those behaviors and make them more likely to occur in the future.
That sounds pretty intuitive, though. I mean, we all know if you give a dog a treat for sitting, it's more likely to sit again next time you ask.
Right, but Skinner's research went way beyond that simple observation. He systematically studied different types of reinforcement, different schedules of reinforcement,
Yeah.
and how all those variables affected behavior.
Oh, wow. Okay. So how did he, like, break down this concept of reinforcement? What were the different types and schedules he looked at?
So, for example, he distinguished between positive reinforcement, which is giving something pleasant to increase a behavior,
Okay.
and negative reinforcement, which is removing something unpleasant to do the same thing.
I see.
Think about it like this. You give a child a sticker for completing their homework. That's positive reinforcement.
Right.
You let them skip chores for finishing their homework early. That's negative reinforcement.
That's a helpful distinction. So it's not just about rewards, it's also about removing negative consequences
Yes.
to kind of encourage a certain behavior.
Exactly.
Okay, and what about those different schedules of reinforcement you mentioned?
Oh, yeah. He explored several. There are fixed ratio schedules where a reward is given after a set number of responses. Like, imagine a coffee shop punch card. Buy 10 coffees, get one free.
Right.
Then there are variable ratio schedules where the number of responses needed for a reward varies randomly. Think of slot machines.
Ah, okay.
You keep pulling that lever because you never know when that next win is coming.
That makes a lot of sense. Like the unpredictability keeps you hooked.
Yeah,
And did these different schedules produce, like, different patterns of behavior?
absolutely. For example, he found that variable ratio schedules, like the slot machine example we just talked about, they tend to produce very high and persistent rates of responding.
Wow. So Skinner's work wasn't just about training pigeons. It was about understanding the fundamental principles of learning and how they apply to all sorts of behavior, both human and animal.
Exactly. And his meticulous methods, his focus on the individual, and his willingness to challenge those conventions truly made him one of the most influential figures in the history of psychology.
That's amazing. But it wasn't all smooth sailing, right?
Mm.
He faced some criticism and controversy, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. His work sparked all these heated debates about free will, determinism, the ethics of behavior control, and those debates are still going strong today.
Wow. But even his, like, most ardent critics would have to acknowledge that he made us think differently about behavior,
Mm.
about learning, and about the influence our environment has on shaping who we are.
Couldn't agree more. And, his legacy continues to inspire new research and new applications of those behavioral principles across all sorts of fields, from education and therapy to business, even artificial intelligence.
That's incredible. So what does all this mean for our listeners, especially those, like, younger folks out there who are still figuring out their paths? What can they take away from Skinner's journey?
Well, I think there are some really valuable takeaways here. Firstly, follow your curiosity. Skinner didn't start in psychology, remember.
Right.
He found his passion by exploring different ideas, reading, engaging with thinkers who challenged his assumptions.
That's such a good point. don't be afraid to dive into subjects that fascinate you, even if they seem outside your comfort zone or expected path.
Exactly.
You never know where that curiosity might lead.
You never know. The world is full of possibilities waiting to be discovered.
I love that.
Secondly, I'd say embrace the unexpected. Some of Skinner's biggest discoveries came from, like, accidental observations or equipment malfunctions.
Right.
He was able to turn those setbacks into breakthroughs by being observant and adaptable.
So it's not always about having this rigid plan, right? Sometimes the most fascinating discoveries happen when you're open to those unexpected twists and turns that life throws at you.
Right on. Don't be afraid to deviate from the plan if something sparks your interest, or if a challenge forces you to think differently.
I like that.
And lastly, don't be afraid to challenge conventions. Skinner wasn't afraid to go against the grain, to question those established methods, and to advocate for a new way of understanding behavior.
So if you believe in something, if you see a better way of doing things, don't be afraid to speak up, push boundaries, challenge the status quo.
Exactly.
It's how progress happens.
Absolutely. Science is all about constant exploration, questioning, and refinement. And that whole process is driven by passionate individuals who aren't afraid to think differently and challenge the world around them.
And on that note, we're going to move on to explore one of Skinner's most fascinating discoveries, the surprising similarities he found in how different species behave.
It's pretty mind-blowing. So we've been deep diving into the world of B.F. Skinner, and before we left off, we were talking about his, fearless approach to challenging the norms.
Right.
And that actually leads perfectly into one of his most mind-boggling findings, those common threads he observed in the behavior of totally different species.
Yeah, it's easy to think about all the ways animals are different. But Skinner's work really showed that there are some basic behavioral patterns that are shockingly similar across species.
Really makes you wonder, huh?
For sure.
He discovered that the fundamental principles of learning, like reinforcement and extinction, they worked just as well for pigeons and rats as they did for monkeys, even humans.
So even though we may look and act differently on the surface, there's a shared blueprint, a common language for how we learn and adapt to our environments.
Yeah, exactly. It's a pretty profound thought, isn't it?
It is.
And one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for this came from a study where he compared the learning curves of a pigeon, a rat, and a monkey.
Okay, an unlikely trio for sure. What did he do in this study? What did he find?
He put each animal on a specific reinforcement schedule, meaning they had to perform a certain action a set number of times to get a reward.
Gotcha.
And when he charted their responses over time, the curves for the pigeon, the rat, and the monkey, they were almost identical.
Hold on. You're saying a pigeon, a rat, and a monkey, despite all their differences, physically, mentally,
Yeah.
they all learned at basically the same rate in the same pattern.
That's exactly what he found.
That's crazy.
It really challenged a lot of assumptions about individual differences and the idea that different species learn in totally different ways.
Right.
It pointed to the possibility of some, universal learning principles that operate across a whole range of living things.
It's amazing. It's like discovering that the same basic blueprint underlies the design of all kinds of different machines, even though they might look and work totally differently on the outside.
Yeah, it's a great analogy.
There's a common thread running through it all.
It highlights the power of Skinner's approach. By stripping away all those superficial differences, he was able to uncover these underlying similarities in how different organisms learn and adapt.
Yeah.
It's like he was cracking the code of learning itself.
So why does this matter to us? Why should we care about these similarities across different species? What's the takeaway for our listeners?
Well, for one thing, it helps us understand those fundamental principles of learning that shape behavior in all sorts of creatures, including ourselves.
Right.
It gives us this broader perspective on our own place in the natural world, We're not quite as unique as we might think.
It's kind of humbling, isn't it? Realizing that we're not so different from all the other animals on this planet, at least when it comes to how we learn and interact with our surroundings.
Exactly.
Makes you think.
And that realization can really foster a sense of humility and interconnectedness. It can also inspire us to think more creatively about how we apply these principles of learning to improve our own lives and the lives of others.
Okay, yeah.
It's pretty exciting stuff when you think about the possibilities.
So whether we're training a pet, teaching a child, or even just trying to break a bad habit, those same basic principles are at play.
That's the beauty of it. These principles are so versatile, so powerful, and by understanding them, we can gain more control over our own behavior. and the impact we have on the world around us.
I love that. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of B.F. Skinner, what's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with today?
I'd say this. Curiosity, observation, and a willingness to challenge conventions can lead to incredible discoveries. Skinner's journey shows us that science isn't just about memorizing facts or following rigid procedures.
Right.
It's about asking questions, exploring the unknown, and being open to the unexpected.
I like that. And sometimes those most profound insights, they come from the simplest observations or even the most accidental discovery.
Absolutely.
So stay curious, keep your eyes open, and don't be afraid to think differently. Who knows what you might find?
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the life and work of B.F. Skinner. We hope you found it insightful and inspiring. Remember, we release new episodes daily, so hit that subscribe button and share this with your friends. You never know, you might just inspire the next B.F. Skinner. And if you're hungry for more, check out www.ultimatemasters.org coaching. Or send a WhatsApp message to +256 771 324 119. We're here to support you on your journey to becoming an ultimate master. Don't forget to share this information with others who might benefit from it. Until next time.
See you then.